D-Day, or the invasion of the Normandy Beaches, involved thousands of planes, ships, and soldiers from 12 different countries. Well, this week, leaders from the Allied nations will mark 80 years since this historic day. And Anne-Marie has a look at what exactly happened during the operation.
Well, Vlad, at roughly midnight, June 6th, the Allies began a complex plan called Operation Overlord. The Allies wanted to prevent Germany from sending reinforcements when the fighting started. Now, the red dots on the map right around here show where planes dropped bombs to destroy German supply routes and defenses before the beach invasion. About 18,000 paratroopers also dropped down behind enemy lines shortly after midnight on D-Day with similar aims. Meanwhile, on board ships, about 132,000 ground troops crossed the English Channel towards Normandy, an invasion route that had not been successful since 1688 because of the waters, very treacherous conditions, and the British naval strength. So the Germans believed the Allied troops would invade at Pas de Calais, up here, where the English Channel was much narrower, instead of the Normandy beaches. So Eisenhower divided about 50 miles of coastline into 5 invasion areas: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The U.S. troops handled operations on the first 2, while British and Canadian troops led assaults on the other 3 beaches. The fighting lasted 24 hours and ultimately resulted in the German Atlantic Wall defense collapsing, which had doomed prior Allied invasion attempts. Vlad.
All right, Anne-Marie, fascinating. Thank you very much. D-Day was, in fact, the largest air, land, and sea assault in history, and it marked the start of a months-long bloody campaign to liberate France from Nazi Germany. To help us understand the importance of this day, we're joined by U.S. Army veteran Michael Bell. He's also the executive director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, you're welcome, Vlad and Anne-Marie. It's great to be with you.
So explain to our viewers just how did the penetration of the German Atlantic Wall defense change the trajectory of the war? The Allies had been on the offensive for some time, but with this invasion, things turned for the Allies and for the worse for the Germans.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You know, there had been what Churchill called peripheral operations in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, on the Eastern Front. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned in 1943, and then the air campaign had really successfully attributed the Luftwaffe of the German Air Force to set the conditions for the campaign. But it was clear that without the invasion, you couldn't break up the German war-making machine and also physically liberate the oppressed peoples of Europe. And so that was the concept behind this massive operation, you know, very, very complex, but also quite decisive because it does initiate the liberation and will lead then to victory in Europe the following May.
Can you dig a little deeper into why this operation worked? You know, I mentioned earlier that they crossed in an area that was challenging, to say the least. Was it about the element of surprise?
You know, I think surprise is one key aspect. They had developed a very sophisticated deception plan in Eastern England that had Patton as the commander of this first U.S. Army group that convinced the Germans that the real attack was going to be at Calais and that Normandy was a diversion. And therefore, that would pin down a number of the German Panzer, the tank divisions that could have decisively affected the operation. And then the next piece they had was they really worked hard to ensure that the assault teams benefited from all the firepower and the other enablers, if you will, tanks, artillery, attached engineers. They planned for air attacks to break up the German obstacles, gunfire from Navy ships. It's very, very sophisticated, but very comprehensive in that. And I think those aspects helped. And then they also tried to do everything from swimming tanks to setting up artificial harbors and pipelines under the water to really enable the operation to continue, because it would have to continue to liberate not only Normandy, but to progress on to Paris and ultimately to Berlin.
Yeah, the operations that you're talking about, I think it was called Operation Fortitude South, which was the deception that the Allies, in particular the English, were able to use to convince the Germans that the attack was going to come in Pas-de-Calais. In fact, Erwin Rommel, the great German field marshal, was actually, I think, visiting his wife. A lot of the senior commanders for the German military were not anywhere near Normandy when the attack was launched. But talk to us about how fraught it was, because part of the reason why the Germans weren't convinced of that particular day in that particular area, because the weather was so bad. So what gave General Eisenhower the foresight to go ahead with those conditions in place?
Yeah, Vlad, that's a great question. The original date set was going to be June 5th, but the weather was so bad, the sea state was so high and heavy that it would swamp the landing craft or the amphibious trucks bringing artillery. And so, but Allied weather stations, up in the British Isles had detected a window where they thought it would be good enough. In some cases, like with the amphibious tanks, you could argue that it wasn't good enough. For example, at Omaha Beach, of the 32 tanks that were supposed to swim ashore, 27 were sunk because the sea state was so high. But that was enough to convince the Germans that there was no way. They saw that as a window where they could do that. The other preparation that I thought was pretty ingenious, we'd actually sent divers onto the Normandy beaches in the months before to check the composition of the sand. Can our vehicles move on this sand? Things like that. And so the preparations were really quite extensive. The other piece in Eisenhower's mind is you couldn't delay too long. If you wait till the tides are perfect again, it will be weeks. And will your deception operation have fallen apart, which would add to the vulnerability.
Michael Bell, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Hey, you're welcome. Thank you.